The Drums of War, Chapter 47, Part 4. But the R&I. Sergeant George clapped Private Ruiz on the shoulder. To the captured warriors, it probably looked like the man stood resolute as his commander acknowledged his efforts. Sergeant George had been watching men move in power armor since before he could walk, though, so he could tell that the man inside was deeply shaken. This was one hell of a first job for the private. He didn't even need the biometrics on his HUD to tell him that his trooper was in distress. "You did well, Ruiz," he told him. "Captures are always better than kills." The man didn't respond, so Sergeant George snapped. "Alvaro!" "Yes, I sir. I mean, Sarge," the private muttered. "You did good, Private," Sergeant George reiterated over the private comms and gave the man a shake. "One shot to the commander while he was trying to squeeze a shot at you, and we get 30 prisoners. 30 prisoners who can tell the enemies outside that surrendering works. Aye, Sarge, it's just, I didn't expect so much blood." "Deep breaths, trooper. You're R&I. It's your job to protect the civilians of the Republic and her allies. This means work, bloody work, and you knew that when you signed up. It's hard work, but you're a strong man. In through your nose and out through your mouth, trooper." Sergeant George watched Private Ruiz's heart rate and breathing slow, and heard the tension in his voice lessen as he said, "Aye, Sarge. Sorry, it's just, I didn't really know." "It's your first drop, kid," Sergeant George said. "We've all been there." The young man nodded, barely perceptible from the outside his armor, but Sergeant George knew what to look for. "Pull some water from your canteen tube and focus on your breathing. Slow in, slow out. The rest of the platoon will be along shortly, and we can move on the final objective. All I need from you is for you to keep your boots down and your head up." "Aye, Sarge," Private Ruiz said thickly, and Sergeant George gave him another encouraging pat on the back. The resulting clang might have spoiled the effect somewhat. Then Sergeant George loaded up the translation software so that his helmet could play something intelligible to the prisoners over the external speakers. "You," he said, pointing at the foremost warrior, "what is your name?" "I am not worthy of a name, Great One," the prisoner said. "Yet I am known as Warrior Lead 64940284. "Fuck that," Sergeant George said, which provoked an amusingly confused expression from the prisoner. It seemed like the nerds hadn't quite gotten the profanity translators dialed in just yet. Or maybe he was just shockingly profane. Either way, it was a sliver of humor and a grim day. But he didn't have long to enjoy it. "I'm calling you Leroy, okay? Leroy, since you're the highest-ranking one here, you're in charge of the other prisoners. You'll be held responsible if anybody misbehaves or causes trouble. Understand?" I believe so, Great One." "First off, knock it off with the Great One nonsense. You can address me as either by my rank or trooper. If your language doesn't have a word for our ranks, calling any of us trooper will be acceptable. You're not likely to be around any of us here to learn our names, so don't worry about trying. Follow all instructions promptly, and if you have an objection, be just as prompt in voicing that objection and explaining it. All efforts that can reasonably be taken to ensure your safety and comfort in captivity will be taken. Do you understand?" "Yes, great, trooper." "Do you have any questions?"
"What shall become of my men?"
"Whatever they can make of themselves, I expect. But I figure you mean what we intend to do with you. Well, we'll hold you prisoner until the conclusion of the war, and maybe a little afterwards, depending on what the politicians and terror decide. We don't intend on mass executions. We don't have any interest in forced labor, and we have no need of occupying your territory. Does that answer your question?"
Leroy blinked in stunned silence before he managed to force up, "Yes, I believe it answers my question and more. Might I ask a question about you?"
"Go ahead."
"For what reason do you believe I am worthy of a name, Leroy?"
"Everyone needs a name, Leroy, and that's the first one that popped into my head. If you don't like it, I can think up on the better one."
No, I shall treasure it always."
Captain George was elsewhere in the palace, feeling itchy. Not the itch of an uncomfortable clothes or an irritation on the skin, but the itch between the shoulder blades of a man anticipating an attack from behind. He hated putting rear guard, but sergeants took point as the company surged forwards in the subterranean warren beneath the palace complex in fits and starts. They'd run out of enemy warriors to fight, and were now up against automated defense systems. The majority of these took the form of corridors that would be highly hazardous to organic life without some serious personal protective equipment. Luckily, R&I's salt pattern power armor was seriously protective to the persons who equipped it. Additionally, there was the occasional seating-mounted laser weapon turret platform, but those were quickly dealt with. However, He'd cautioned the lieutenants to keep their men's enthusiasm in check. This was exactly the kind of place overconfident troopers found nasty surprises. It was those nasty surprises that made him hate playing tail end Charlie. But rank has as many downsides as privileges. More downsides, by his reckoning. But no R&I trooper turns down a promotion. Not if he has any self-respect, anyway. He hated putting his officers and NCOs into harm's way that he had faced before. If not in the same way, it was similar enough. On the other hand, he knew there was only one of him, and there were more points ahead than he could cover. He and his 2 gunnery sergeants could cover the approach to the company, especially after the troopers had reduced anything attempting to make the area less hospitable to heaps of the sparking scrap. It was surprising how little the actual tunnels differed from the maps recovered from Azad, especially when one remembered that the files were copied from were several hundred centuries old. The Sagzur had apparently found very little need to expand or alter its housing. Odd. He was keeping an ear out for trouble across all of his company's channels, and an eye on the couple of point men's helmet cam feeds on his HUD, and felt pretty confident that without the man-portable shoulder-operated howitzer-class railgun, he'd be able to get to any of the forward squads in short order, which wasn't to say that he wasn't weighed down. Without that cumbersome but very useful outside-the-tunnels weapon, he and his gunnery sergeants had made themselves into mobile company resupply depot and carried spare ammo, medical supplies, and repair parts and tools for power armor. 20 seconds, max. He was listening to his 2nd platoon's theta squad confirm that the potential flanking approach had been secured when one of the nasty surprises struck. Explosives. It was always explosives. Even over the general discordant symphony of battle, he heard the dull roar that was misplaced even in that ugly music. He hadn't finished sending up a Hail Mary when he heard a young, panicked voice say, man down, armor breach, oh God, oh God, oh God." Captain George isolated 2nd Lieutenant Takada's comms and said, "Assess his injury now, Lieutenant." Then he started a leaping sprint of a man in power armor who didn't care about bouncing off walls to get somewhere quickly. On the way, he saw one of the corpsmen and snapped him up with the command, "Corpsman!" before keying back to the private channel with Lieutenant Takada. "Lieutenant," he snapped again. I, sir, the lieutenant stammered. He's been thrown to one side. Concussion, abdominal armor breach. I put him in the back because his shields were burned out, sir." "That's the right move, kid. Places like this tend to have nasty surprises," he said as he and the corpsman arrived. Lieutenant Takeda was kneeling over the wounded trooper and struggling to remove its damaged portions with the limited tool set that he had on him. Captain George slid to a stop beside the younger officer, even as his hands splashed to make the required tools appear in them. It was nasty. There wasn't much blood, and the temp readout on the HUD told him that the breach was hot. A bad sign. He checked the man's vitals and found the heartbeat irregular, breathing irregular, and brain activity indicators sporadic. He worked fast. However, when the charred wound was finally exposed, the corpsman took one look at it and pulled painkillers out of his kit. Another bad sign. Captain George had been around men in power armor since before he could talk. He could see the minute shaking, the slight hunch in posture, the tiny motions of the helmet that others might miss. "Takeda," he snapped, "don't you dare degrade Corporal Burgle's choices. Don't you fucking dare." "Sir?" the shaken officer breathed. "We volunteered for this, and we knew we might die. Don't you fucking dare start blaming yourself for the risk this man had the courage to shoulder on his own will." "But it was my orders, sir. If I had—" "What different orders could you have given?" The almost imperceptible trembling in Lieutenant Takeda's gauntlet slowed as he said, "I don't know, sir, but this man trusted me, and so did the rest of your men. Don't crack now." Captain George checked Lieutenant Takeda's vitals and saw that he was calming down as he said, "Aye, sir, I can regulate, sir." Captain George turned to the corpsman and said, "You know what to do?" "Aye, sir." General George was at that moment helping his staff to dismantle a small portion of the command center's communications equipment. The map display, a couple monitors, and a portion of the communications console all came apart in such a way that the 5 men could carry them at various attachment points on their armor. "Any word on getting some damn coffee down here?" he asked as he stepped out from the temporary building and out into the open once more. "No, sir," Captain Ironcloud said sadly. "The Navy boys say that we'll have to come up to the galley and they'll have a hot cup ready for us. Those bastards," Lieutenant Colonel Von Guter growled mock fury. I suppose they think that we shall defeat the enemy with more electricity if they don't give us our sweet nectar, Captain Satter waxed philosophically. Speaking of, General George said in more serious tones, what's the composition of these captured enemies?
29 warriors and an NCO equivalent, Major Jarosek said quickly. Interestingly, they sounded out in commercial English word for surrender.
That is likely to be the result of groundwork from the DRS men, and perhaps some of our pacifist friends were more effective than the missionary work that we expected.
As they spoke, they crossed the now silent area between the known inner defense line towards what was once the palace complex's front gate. General George was mindful of the fact that historians and journalists would be poring over the drone footage to find striking imagery to use in their trades. Therefore, he took care to not trip as he stamped on the ornate brazen doors laying flat on the plaza before the palace walls. Wouldn't want the history books to remember him as the general who tripped.
Where will we set up next, sir? Lieutenant Colonel Van Guter asked as they passed under the shadow of the scattered archway that once held the doors. I think at the rate they're clearing the palace complex, we'll want to move up a gate by the time we get set up.
Aye, sir. Mobile CC it is, sir. Setting up beacon.
Any word from the subterranean?
Aye, sir. It's slow going. Maps are accurate enough, though. Low danger, some casualties caused by explosive traps, though.
Let's hope I'll be approving some Martian crosses and not signing the "it is my solemn duty to inform you" letters.
Aye, sir. The general thought he heard a tinge of sorrow in those syllables. He pushed that to the back of his mind. There would be time to grieve the latest fallen later. Later. Just like there was time to grieve all the old fallen later, once the Republic, her civilians, and her allies were safe again. There would be time to grieve. Sir, Captain Satter began, the city is in full riot. The warriors are turning on one another. The workers are taking up weapons of the fallen. Some of the nobles are siding with the rebels and leading warriors against the other nobles and their warriors. And the enemy doesn't have any attention to spare on attacking our defensive line. Recon says they're saying, "Become your own master," or something like that.
In that case, give 3rd Division to Sortie, the general said. In a slave revolt, I am of the mind to take the slave's side. I want them to focus on civilian evac and rescue operations over combat. Telling who's who is difficult in this kind of conflict.
Aye, sir. Among the exarch, Juvenile 93769758 stared out what was once a piece of ceiling. She had thought her plan to hide was clever, cunning even, but now she realized that she might have been better served by simply fleeing the Skylight people and their terrible weapons. Now she was perfectly unharmed and trapped beneath the ground. None would even know where to search for her. Juvenile 93769758 let the tears flow as she tried to stifle her sobs. She knew that there was none there to report her for weakness, but old habits die hard, even in the young. She fell silent when she heard the unmistakable sound of shifting rubble. Juvenile 93769758 cast a gaze about her hiding place and was relieved to see that the walls and ceiling were not caving in upon her. The piece of ceiling, that removable barrier that had secured her doomed solitude, moved. Hope leapt into her heart, only to shrivel up and die when a massive piece of rubble was cast aside by the void-black figure with burning red eyes that had moved it. One of the Skylight people was there to visit the vengeance of the goddess Republic upon her. She screamed in terror, and would have kept screaming, except the being of an unfathomable power said, "I have sorrow. I forgot that my helmet was still prepared for battle." And the face of the void-black fury faded to reveal that it was merely a faceplate covering a furry muzzle with yellow eyes sitting above it. She thought the orange fur of the being's face had a pretty striping. The voice was too mechanical to be very pretty, though. It was surprisingly easy to initiate Highborn Veritzen once it had begun to go on as he had. The first step into being his own master had been terrifying, nearly unthinkable. But he found that asking himself what shall be done next became easier with practice. Fighting did not. He had, of course, killed at orders of the acolyte lord or a priest lord before, but that had been different. He decided to take the lives of other people for his own reasons now, to achieve his self-mastery, and now he must judge whether it was worthy. He knew not whether it was. Yet he now reasoned with the priest lord. "I have mastered myself. I shall determine whether and where my service shall lie. Yet Exor is our God. How can you so readily deny his power? Look about you. What power? The power to contend him lies the vengeful goddess Republic, not us. Yet her sons are here. The very tip of her spear does enter the palace itself as we speak, Initiate Highborn Varidzin insisted. The higher noble's reserve broke, and his face showed open worry and pain. Yet they regard we as enemies. Those beneath my command shall surely state their thirst for blood in the stead of Axur. Shall she not be even more cruel to avenge the insult and injuries done to her? Is it not too late to appease her? Even palace guards have submitted to the sons of the vengeful goddess Republic, and they yet live. For the word of power works, soar and door, and your hands in the air shall preserve your life. Initiate Highborn Varidzin thought that he could see a glimmer of hope behind the priest-lord's eyes. With the RNI, Sergeant George was on point again, and Alpha Squad formed the tip of the spear for this objective. It was coming into sight. The large, heavy, ornate doors that led to the misnamed throne room loomed over the corridor and seemed to be impassable and immovable. Sergeant George shut it off at its hinges. Inside, a half-dozen warriors didn't heed his orders to throw down their weapons and surrender, or at least phrase that amounted to something close enough to surrender. Obviously, those half-dozen warriors were summarily perforated with ferrous material. "The rest of you, put your hands on your heads and get into your knees," he said, and his helmet translated it for him. The servants complied, and Sergeant George silently thanked Christ that they did. Then he waved the rest of the squad forward to secure the 24 attendants as prisoners. Then he turned his attention to the Emperor. The Xeno's man's skin was sallow, faded pink, rather than the natural scarlet of his kind. His limbs were nearly skeletal, with atrophy. He struggled with every breath, and he sagged against the support of the cables in his skull, holding him limply erect. Any idiot could see that the man was suffering. If these Xenos knew what decency was, they would have let the poor man die ages ago. "Warrior," he rasped in a voice that was smooth as sandpaper grating against itself. "You are a fool." "Shut up," Sergeant George said to the thing controlling the puppet of flesh the Exarch mistook for the Emperor. "Unless you're willing to let go of that poor creature." "Perhaps it is worn out, and its mate has failed to produce a replacement. Here is a new stock to use." The puppet cackled, and Sergeant George felt a pressure, something like an oncoming migraine, but almost as soon as he was aware of the sensation, it was gone. The flesh puppet flailed as Axur used his voice to wail in pain. Spittle flew from his lips, and his eyes rolled in their sockets, and blood spurted from his nostrils in a sudden font. Sergeant George could add 1 and 1 to get to 2. He raised a gauntleted finger and waggled it at the flesh puppet and said, "No touching. You dare defy a god?" Sergeant George scoffed. "You're about as much a god as I am an angel. Show some dignity before we kill you." "You dare! Worm! Beetle! You will be devoured to your very soul for your insolence." "Shut up," Sergeant George repeated. "The general will be along shortly." The thing controlling the tortured waif might have wanted to retort, but General George and his staff strode in that very moment. Instantly, all RNI troopers present snapped to full attention and saluted, to which the general returned the salute and said, "As you were, gentlemen, but I'll remind you that we're still under operation." "Aye, sir, but it seemed like some formality was called for," Sergeant George told his father, grinning behind his faceplate. "You speak to one another," the puppet rasped. "Who is this?" "My name is Major General Eric George," the general said as he removed his helmet and held it tucked under one arm so the enemy would be able to look him in the eye. He spoke the thing's language flawlessly and had practiced the specific things he wanted to say. "I am here to accept the surrender from the Emperor of the Exarch Dominion, as well as to tell you certain things." The puppet erupted in a cackling, and all the while he said, "You fool has no ability to surrender. It doesn't even know how." "We'll explain it to him once he's free." "How? Think you I shall allow it to live should you try to disconnect it? I am the true Emperor of the Dominion, and I say never shall I submit to a mere fleshling." "Your cooperation is neither required nor desired. I wanted you to know a few things before the end." "The end?" The general offered a grim smile and said, "Your end. First, you shouldn't have hurt our trading partners, the Dynasticals. We have a treaty of mutual defense, so our coming to their aid was assured.
But that was the least of your mistakes. Mistakes? What fool? General George spoke over the mouthpiece like he was an oncoming avalanche. Boss, you attacked, sunk, and sometimes captured Star Sailor ships, which is as bad as doing that to a Republican ship. We don't like that shit. Do not touch our boats. Foolish. Really, after we found out about that, there was very little chance that you'd come out of this war alive. But you had to go around and murder the among the star tides we sing. And among all of our ships, she was the most beloved because she brought my people their first friends amongst the stars. There was never any chance that we'd forgive you for murdering her and her crew. So this is why you have to die. Here. Now. Today. I'm going to watch the thing that killed my sons, nephew, friends, my old home fucking die. And there's not a thing that it can do to stop what's coming. And really, the best part is another of my sons is planting the explosives that will kill you as we speak. Silence fell in the throne room, and deep below the ground, Captain George pressed the trigger of the detonator with a savage grin on his face. Above, General George showed the thing his teeth as the puppet of flesh flailed as the thing controlling it panicked. A few seconds later, and the freed Emperor was heaving in the throne, struggling to ask, What is surrender? It means you stop being the enemy, and that will mean you don't have to be destroyed, the general answered in a more gentle voice. Tell me how this can be accomplished. End of chapter. I'd quickly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.